Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Afterlife. In life, I did as many of you do, and I made all of the right plans to take care of my family in the event of my passing. I had a will, an estate plan. I managed our financial accounts. I had accounts all organized. I had checklists. I had done seemingly everything perfectly. And when Doug died, it all went out the window. Even though I had all of the tools and the resources necessary to execute on all of the administrative tasks that are needed after the loss of a spouse, I simply was unable to do it because I was in a state of such deep grief and shock. And as I've mentioned, I just wasn't functioning. My mind wasn't there, my attention wasn't there, my focus wasn't there, and everything seemed so very hopeless. And that's where it's really important to ensure that, in addition to all of the preparations we do beforehand, that we have a clear path and a plan and a person we can depend on for those moments after death. And with that, I'd like to introduce my next guest. This is Jason Fang. Jason is the founder of TerraFirma Wealth Partners here in the Bay Area. Jason has been a part of my life and my husband's life for well over a decade. We've known each other since before we had children and before he was married and before he had children. And he, simply put, was a lifesaver to me after Doug died. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my absolute pleasure, Samina. I've seen you go through this journey, and I know it's been challenging, but you've been growing and doing amazing things.
Thank you. And, in addition to being a dear friend and a trusted advisor and our investment advisor, you simply have this way of making our relationship seem more than a professional relationship. And I think because, as I've witnessed, it's because you put your heart and soul and care into your clients. I know I'm a client, but I also consider you a friend.
Likewise.
Jason, tell me, what brought you into this role of investment advisory and, what really, in my opinion, sets you apart from other investment advisors?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think deep down for a long time, I've had this desire to help people. After I graduated from college, I had studied real estate finance. It was '06, and the world was starting to go this way, especially in the financial world. And I was doing mortgages, really did not feel like I was helping anybody, kind of contributing to the problem, really. And so I didn't last long in that world. I quickly shifted over to financial planning. So at the end of '06, my journey into financial planning started. And so that's how I transitioned in.
And I'm so grateful you did. And I met you at a time where you were working for a large investment firm, and now I'm so proud of you. You've branched off and you have your own firm. One of the things that really struck me was you were at Doug's memorial service, and I really only have snippets of recollections because I was in such a daze and on some medication to get me through. But I remember you attended and you brought my twin girls who you hadn't met. You'd heard of them, of course, over the years, but you brought them Care Bears. You were the only person who was thoughtful enough to consider how traumatic and difficult that day was for my children, and you brought them something of comfort. Tell me, what led you to that? How were you so intuitive to know to do that?
Leading up to that day, I primarily thought about you and your daughters. And I knew that you being the spouse, you'd probably be getting a lot of attention. And you've been in those kinds of environments before where you're the center of attention, but your girls have not. And they just went through something traumatic. I know that being a child in that situation is extremely difficult. Something that I'm open to sharing is the fact that I lost my dad when I was young. I was 11. And I remember then that all of the attention was on the adults in the room. And as a child, I felt totally lost. I was questioning reality. I wasn't sure if, hey, is this real? Is this something that is going to change my life? And it most certainly did. It probably helps if I give even more background around that moment that I had. My family immigrated from China in 1988, and I was 4 years old at the time. And so there were the four of us, my parents, my older brother, Andy. My parents knew very little English, and they mainly worked in restaurants. And in pursuit of the American dream, they opened up their own restaurant in 93. 2 years later, my dad got really sick. It was cancer. He was gone in less than 6 months. So my mom was then left in a country where she barely speaks the language and had to raise myself, age 11 at the time, my brother, who had just turned 17. And so through that experience, I knew that my mom was grieving. All the adults in the room came to her. Nobody really knew how to talk to a child. As an adult, I could sympathize with that because it's hard to know how much do they understand. But I think we should give children some more credit that they probably understand more than we think. But there are common threads that are necessary for a person who has gone through trauma, right? They need some sort of comfort. They need some sort of grounding to come back to and feel like, oh, this is going to be okay somehow. So I thought of bringing Care Bears, and I tried to figure out, how to match up the Care Bears to your daughters, and have that be a bit of a channeling of strength of some kind, but also some way for them to feel like children, right? Because when you lose a parent, you actually have to start growing up pretty quickly. And I didn't want that for your daughters to be forced into losing part of their childhood so quickly. And so that was just really a small token to hopefully have them still feel like, I've got part of my childhood still.
You said a small token, but actually it was an enormous gesture of care. And I do want to, again, I'm so grateful because even I forgot about them in that moment. I was focused on my grief because, we were all grieving. But because of the experience that you went through and probably watching your mother struggle, I'm sure she did. Do you think that influenced your approach to financial planning and how you interact with your clients today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this really drives into the heart of, why I do what I do. Because when you go through loss, or at least if you're kind of adjacent to it, you start to understand the immense difficulty that that person has in running this marathon of life. And the reality is, the person that's going through loss, they're not able to run. They can barely get up.
That's right.
And when they do get up, they're actually starting the race, 15 miles back and 5 hours late.
Right.
And so for me as a professional, I feel like I can recognize that better than the average person that maybe has perhaps not been through that kind of loss themselves. Because the survivors, they try to put on a happy face and say, hey, things are going to be okay. And inside, they may not feel that way. And so other people don't necessarily pick up on the fact that, yeah, I'm still stuck in this mud and I can't lift a leg. I don't know where the finish line is. And this is just really, really hard. And so I try to recognize that, first of all. And then secondly, I try to make sure that I give the empathy in the room for people to take that next step. I can't always take it for them, but I can kind of push apart some of the things that are getting in the way. And that's largely how I see my role. I know the steps to take. I can take your hand and say, the next step is here. I've cleared some of these obstacles. Just put your foot there. Trust me, it's going to be okay. And then after that, there's going to be another step, but we're only going to take that when you're ready. and so on and so forth until you can actually get back to a more comfortable, normal stride.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you did with me. I did not put on that happy face. I think I was, I don't know what I was, but I don't think I even had the energy or the spirit to do that. But I knew there were so many things I needed to do. Again, that rational brain knows what needs to be done, but, just your heart and the soul are crushed and you just can't pick yourself up off the floor. And you actually came to my house. You had you had your own checklist and you knew exactly what needed to be done. You've been managing our accounts for well over a decade, but you did clear those obstacles. You came to the house. I remember you bought pastries and we sat and we had coffee and you very gently but in a detailed way explained everything that needed to be done. And it was just, if I didn't have you, it was overwhelming. It was still overwhelming with you, but it was less overwhelming because I had you.
Well, I'm glad that I was able to do that. And I appreciate you recognizing that. It's something that I wish I had been able to do for my mom, but certainly as an 11-year-old, I didn't know how to help. But I did see her struggle. And I know that if she had gotten a similar kind of help during that time, things would have been a little bit easier. Not that it ever becomes easy, but certainly having help and the knowledge that you can lean on some people, I think that that goes a long way. And one thing that my mom told me a long time ago is that it's okay to not go to people's weddings, but it's not okay to not go to people's funerals. And I think what she meant by that is, the good times everyone shows up for. Everyone wants to be there for that. But for the bad times, your value, your relationship with the person is defined by these difficult, challenging moments. They're going to remember that much, much more than sipping some Mai Tais on a beach. Everyone wants to go there. But getting through the muck, getting through the dark days when the clouds simply won't part, that means a lot more.
That's exactly what it is. In fact, the past few episodes, I've spoken with my guests, and we've talked about the value of relationships, the value of showing up for people, and also the value of choosing to surround yourself with the right people in your lives. What no one realizes is, we talk about death, we talk about kind of all of the steps that need to be taken. And I think beyond a funeral memorial service, people just don't realize how much work there needs to be done. And it's a full-time job. In fact, I looked up the research on it, and let's say, to execute final wishes takes all the administrative work, takes somewhere between 30 to 100 hours of someone's time, either the surviving spouse or the executor. And I know it took me well over a year to get things settled. And that was me having been a type A person, having had everything in place. I had everything in place. And yet it still took me that amount of time. And it was such a slog. And I think, what might be interesting to explore a little for viewers and listeners is kind of like all of the things that have to be done, because it's not easy. It's incredibly redundant, and it's unfortunately painfully disconnected. So you're repeating yourself a lot. One of the first things you do, of course, is when you've decided who is going to take the body, funeral home or cremation home, the important thing is they provide the death certificate. And it's important that you get multiple copies of the death certificate, which you pay for. I think I got 5 or 10. Is there a correct number that you should get, or does it depend on the complexity of your estate?
Yeah, it does depend on the complexity of the estate. I generally think that 5 is a good number. Most financial firms do not require originals. So even if you have 10 different accounts at 10 different institutions, that's okay. They'll take an electronic copy or a paper copy. An original is generally not required for that. For other firms, other institutions that need the originals, yeah, you want to have a handful of those around.
Right. And so I guess you don't really know who needs what until after the fact. So you almost have to order these guessing a little bit and figuring out who needs what, because What I found out was that no firm puts on its website how to notify them of a passing. So you're forced to make a phone call and be on hold and repeat yourself seemingly 100 times, very painfully, that your husband or your wife just died, and, accept false condolences and still be put on hold. And then only to
Yeah.
be told very easy instructions. It just could have been very, very simple. Here's the address and this is what we need you to send us. But no, it's not that easy. And I think we all go through that. And I do know that Social Security requires an original death certificate. And I think, in my estimation, you correct me if I'm wrong, but, that was one of the first calls I made with Social Security, not for the survivor benefits that everyone gets. I think it's $250. It's negligible, but I did it for my children.
Right.
So, I needed original death certificates for them. And
Mhm.
then I needed their birth certificates, of course. And they had Social Security cards. But what was interesting is, I have twins and I was filing for the benefits for them in the same appointment. But I had to have two original death certificates for each of them. And I had
Yeah.
to have their, two applications. So very redundant there.
Yeah. Yeah, you're hitting on something that I think is really important in that, each person's situation is different. And so if you have more children, that might mean you may need more originals. And depending on what kind of assets you have, the process may look different depending on the type of asset. So, for example, if you have commercial real estate versus your own home, that's going to look a little different. And certainly investment accounts. The process is fairly similar there from firm to firm. I do recommend though that if you're able to get some professional help, it's easy to make mistakes. It's easy to overlook a step, and you usually can't go back on these things. Once it's transferred, you can't transfer it back and say, hey, I actually wanted to do it in this slightly different way, which might actually be much, much better for me in terms of taxes or some other consequence. Yeah, there's no like simple boilerplate of exactly how to go about this, which is part of the problem. And so getting that professional help from someone who knows how to go through this process to evaluate your situation and say, okay, you have these types of things. Here are the steps you need to take for those items. And then for these other types of assets, here's how you need to go about that. You mentioned it's an overwhelming time. And for you to learn this entire new activity during an overwhelming time is just not a good idea. And so I think one piece of advice is, I guess this is maybe for the people that are around that surviving spouse, is to help build them a network. And this can come in many forms. And so this can come in the form of a meal train because you may not want to cook. What about the kids going to school? And if you can't drive, daily tasks are one thing. Then you've got the financial, then you've got the legal. But there are things that other people can actually help with. So you mentioned being on the phone and having this dehumanizing experience of having to tell some stranger this very intimate, awful detail that just happened to you
Yeah.
over and over again. It's horrible. So if you could have a friend or a family member just get on the phone with someone until you need to actually speak with them to confirm identity or whatever it might be, but to just have someone else tell that story so that you don't have to tell it, I think would be an avoidance of so much pain, yeah, especially in those initial days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had a friend of mine actually make her Social Security appointment because that in and of itself was, ridiculous because, again, we didn't know the process, but you do have to make an appointment with Social Security. Then you go in, and obviously I had to go in, but she made the initial contact, and I was in the background. But you made a comment about you can make a mistake with those assets. The one time I didn't reach out to you, I was taking over some of my mother passed away in 2019, and I was getting an account transferred over, and I was trying to liquidate everything to put it into my account. And I thought, oh, this is easy. And I checked off the wrong box because I didn't reach out to you. And now I'm sitting here with this account in an investment bank with a certain designation that I can't really do very much with. And so it's not really earning anything. It's not rolled into my existing portfolio. It just sits there. It hangs there. And here I am. I was always the one who made the decisions. I was the one who managed, with you, all of our assets, and I made the mistake. So I think your point about, making sure you have someone, a fiduciary, someone who can understand what's going on so that you don't make those costly mistakes. Because, the statistics on financial hardship with people who have lost their spouse are quite high. They're like somewhere between 40 and 50% of people who have lost their spouse face financial hardship. And that's due to a variety of reasons. But to make the mistakes, the mistakes are costly. And you really can't afford to make a mistake when you are dealing with Social Security or life insurance, the life insurance payment, because for many people, that money is their lifeline. They need that money. So to your point, this is not an area to try to do it yourself. Not just because you may not have the ability, skill set, but because your mind is not thinking clearly. And even just those disclaimers they play on the phone or the 9-page fine print papers they send you in the mail, they're not written in any easy to understand language, and they're not meant for people. They're meant to satisfy fiduciary and legal regulations. They're not really meant to be user friendly. So I would imagine the rate of making mistakes is quite high. And it's quite unfortunate, again, because it could be a sole source of income for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. Living in America, most families have dual incomes. That's the only way we're able to afford, living in
Anything.
America. And so when one source of income is gone, your original plan is no longer intact, right? So there's a lot that needs to be done there. And you need to create a plan, but who can think 5, 10 years down the road when you're going through that kind of trauma? I think it's impossible to have the wherewithal to create a good plan like that. I mean, even in good times, how many people can make a good plan for the next 5, 10 years? And so having that professional help is really critical, especially in that moment when you're transferring assets from a person who has passed. There's a lot of one-way doors. And so you have to tread carefully. You make a decision, you check a box, and you may not think much of it, but to your point and your experience, you can't go back.
No, I've tried.
Once they process it, yeah.
Yeah, I've tried, and yeah, it's not possible. So it just hangs there in eternity, I guess. I don't know what I did. I don't know exactly what I checked, but I didn't check the right box. I think also something I heard from someone else's experience, not my own, and so I knew not to make it, but I think is so important is, in the kind of administration period of time, like, who are the people to notify? Some really great advice you gave me was, you need to notify the credit card companies because you need to figure out, to put a stop on that. But you also recommended I contact the credit bureaus to freeze my husband's credit so that it wasn't open to any fraudulent activity. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really important thing that people don't know. And I certainly hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, you will often hear about, some credit cards existing for a person who's no longer alive. And it's because those lines of credit are still alive. If they don't get notified, how are they to really know? And you talk about different systems. Our credit bureaus are not technically government entities. So they don't get this automatic forward of an email that says, hey, this person, they need to update their status. You have to update it with so many different entities. And so having a organized checklist and making sure you go through one by one. And again, this is something that someone can help you with. So being organized, having an understanding of these are the different systems that we have to work with. Here are the ways that we can get help from professionals, and here are the things that we actually have to do on our own.
Hmm.
Will, I think, bring some sort of sense to the entire issue, because when you're going through it, I think for most people, you just don't know what you don't know, and it
Right.
seems like everything has to be done. But the reality is, you can accomplish this much per day.
If
And
even that
so
much. If
right,
even that
if
much.
some days it's nothing, right? But on the days that you do have some ability to get something done, then focus on the right things, right? Focus on the things that are the most urgent and the most important. There are some things that we can actually wait until later, and there are some things that really just need to be done right away. And so understanding which one goes where and then starting to tackling it from top down is the best way to go.
Right. And then if we were to do that, again, in my order, I did the Social Security as one of my first appointments. Making the appointment doesn't mean it's happening for a few weeks, but of course, it all starts with getting those death certificates. But it was Social Security because my kids were in school and getting that done just for that peace of mind. And then I contacted some of the utility companies, or my
Yeah.
friends, my community, that contacted the utility companies to understand. And of course, my husband had all the utilities in his name. So they made the changes to ensure there were no service interruptions. And that's really important. So we needed the internet and all of that. So I had one friend who is an IT security expert. He took all of the techie types of things.
Mm,
And this is also something that came up in my discussion with Abby Reyes. She said, find your core skill and try to lead with that as a way to help. And so I took my friends actually identified their strengths, and they all
yeah.
chunked up parts of this responsibility. And so, one did the Social Security and all of the cooking and the meal train, and another one did all the utility accounts and all the techie things around the house. And, another person made all the phone call, tried to make some of the phone calls to find out what was going on. And that I needed to be there on a lot of those calls because they needed to confirm on recorded lines that I was the
Right.
person. And, it was DMV. It was just really the big things we did first were the things to prevent fraud while we figured it out. But it did take me a year. And I'm not even done with some of the stuff. And this is almost 2.5 years. There are
Right.
still things outstanding that I've started and I've stopped and I've started and I've stopped, and it still gets me upset and I still can't see it to completion. But the fact is I have to do it.
There are some things that unfortunately we can't delegate, but it's good to know what's the most urgent. The other thing is updating beneficiaries.
Mm,
That's really important on all of the various accounts and assets that you own. Going to workplace benefits. So if you have other insurance that we no longer need, health, vision, dental, these kinds of things, let's not overpay for that. Let's not keep having car insurance for a person that's not around. All these things that are expenses, while it's good to kind of bring things in, it's also good to make sure that we don't leak out anything that we shouldn't.
that's
And
true.
so,
Yes.
you kind of have to play offense and defense at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting because, in those moments it's like, how do I get everything done? And and I was highly organized. The one thing I didn't do, which I found quite surprising, was in our will, our lawyer had drawn up that we bequeathing one another access to everything, all assets, including all digital assets. And one would think that cell phones are part of it. And I got stuck in quite a tangled mess with Apple because I could not remember his password and I couldn't get into his phone. And to me, that was really, really important. And Apple would not unlock it for me, and they would not honor the will. The language of the will that said all digital assets was not specific enough for them. And in fact, they overrode it, and they said that I should, or he should have put in a legacy contact. So the one thing, if I could share for anyone listening or watching, please make sure you put your spouse in or someone in as a legacy contact, because that was a very costly endeavor. I had to take Apple to court, and I had to file a legal motion and a petition with a judge to get them to release his iCloud for me because I didn't have access to his photos, his photo library, all of the things that, he was the main person on our security accounts. I couldn't deactivate anything because they were all tied to his phone, his Apple account. So that's a huge lesson, a very expensive lesson that I learned that I hope to share with others. You don't make it.
No, that's a great point. The thing about digital assets is that an estate plan that was created 10 years ago probably has zero mention of any digital assets. And increasingly, our lives exist on the cloud somewhere.
Right.
And so I think one tip for couples is to get a password manager, pay the $5 a month, and most of them will allow you to share passwords. So, I mean, this is just a convenience thing that my wife and I have too. But I also know that if I'm gone, she has access to all of these passwords, and she can kind of jump in and take care of things if necessary. So, having access to it, but also to your point about the estate plan detailing these specifics, this is really important because what if we have digital assets like cryptocurrencies, right? Uh, Bitcoin
Yeah.
is worth quite a bit these days,
Yeah.
and if Doug had gotten into it 10 years ago, my goodness, that would be worth quite a bit.
Yeah.
And not having access to that, you've read some of the news articles about
I
people digging
have.
through,
Like
landfills to find a
landfills.
thumb
Yeah.
drive.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. Our estate plan was updated fairly recently too. And so the premise was digital assets covered everything. But in fact, Apple had its own process. And, I was forced to go to court. And, think about the angst I was going through. All I wanted was to see his pictures. All I
Yeah,
wanted was the memories. And I had to fight legally for that. And that was, just such an unfortunate time. And it really was infuriating. So I do tell everybody that I meet, make sure you've assigned a legacy contact. And now I have one. I have a legacy contact in the event of, my passing so that this doesn't happen for me.
right. Yeah, this is the equivalent of assigning beneficiaries for all of your
Exactly.
digital assets. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think so many people sign up, have accounts, and I read this. They have accounts, and before they're married, and they have their parents on as beneficiaries, and then that spouse passes, and the money doesn't go to the spouse; it goes to a parent, and then there are family conflicts over that estate. But I think it really is so important if you do anything based on on this podcast, listening or watching, make sure your beneficiaries are updated so the right people have access to it. Because again, we're planning. This is all planning that we're talking about. But I had a plan, and I lost my husband in the blink of an eye unexpectedly. It was not planned. Accidents happen. I mean, tragedies are surrounding us. The weather is changing. There's so many things that could happen, and it's quite sad and frightening. But as we get older, that's our reality.
It unfortunately is. And so being prepared is a great thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve all of the problems, but you can prevent a lot of issues. And you touched on family dynamics. This is something that takes a lot of work, but if you put the work into it, then you can make that really difficult moment in life a little bit easier. And so with family dynamics, I think it's really tragic that families split over money. You can make money back. You can't make family members back, right? Or repair relationships
Right.
sometimes. And so for parents, I think it's important, especially as your children grow older, that you help them to understand what your plans are for the estate. You communicate to them. You don't have to say the dollar amounts, but you can say, hey, this house, does anyone want to live in it? Do you want to keep it after we're gone? If everybody says no, great, we sell it and split the assets, right? But if someone does want to keep it, and it was always in the back of their mind that they would, have their kids grow up in that house, well, that's really important to know. And that's really important to consider, well, how do we make this equal amongst the other siblings? And so beyond just that first layer of, all right, let's make sure we have a plan, make sure you have a plan that people are going to be okay with and that they're not going to fight about. And the easiest way is to have some sort of family meeting where everyone's in the same room at the same time. And you tell them, here's what our plan is. Do you have anything to say about that? Do you have objections? Do you have strong wishes that we should consider as part of this plan? And I think that preventative medicine is just worth so much because after that person is gone, after the parents or parents are gone, then everything is usually set in stone, right? The revocable trust becomes irrevocable. And so legally, if it wasn't updated to your point, if it was pointing the assets towards a previous relationship, that's really tragic. Some kids get disinherited on accident, and that's not something that you want to have if you want peace and unity and love in the family after you're gone.
Right. I think the clarity is so important. When my dad, he passed away many years ago, but I he was going in for a kidney transplant, and he was quite a bit older. So the risk of any surgery at that age, at his age, was high. And we sat down and I detailed every single one of his accounts. And what I also did was take the name of his lawyer, because I didn't even know his lawyer's name. And so I had everything. I was the executor. So even then it was quite complicated, but I knew exactly who to call. I knew exactly what the account numbers were. I knew amounts. I knew, everything. And that made it easier. But I think also, we did that with a sound mind, and we were rational. And by contrast, I lost a very, very dear friend of mine. And after she passed away, her sons didn't really, they didn't know where the will was. They didn't know who the lawyer was. Just having a passing conversation, not an intentional, thoughtful, detailed conversation. Those are very different. And I know they're difficult to have. I know no one wants to think about it. People put it off because, I think people are just afraid to talk about it. It's morbid, it's scary, it's emotional. But it's really important to have a very clear conversation with the details, because if you wait until it's too late, that's when things get messy. That's when things get confusing. That's when mistakes are made. And that's when, people are hurt, or, worse, you're fighting, or there's a will is not updated or is invalidated or wasn't signed, or there's so many different things that can happen that impact those who survive's lives. But you just have to have the courage and the clarity of mind to have those conversations when all is well.
Absolutely. When we go through those difficult moments of someone passing away, we're extremely emotional. And so to have to decipher what's going on and hear it for the first time can often be really, really difficult, because you might assume the worst and say, wait, why do I only get this? I thought they loved me. They don't love me. And then you're kind of tossed into this crazy vortex that may or may not be true. But you're absolutely right that having that detailed conversation about what the intentions are and how this is going to work puts everyone on the same page and eliminates or reduces some of those questions that some people really just don't need to have, but sometimes pop up.
Yeah, and I think, the more planful you can be in the beginning, the better. But again, at the end, when it's time to execute on the person who's passed away, on their wishes, it is a very long slog. It is a very disconnected process. It does require a lot of mental energy. And I think the key is really to your points, prioritizing the most urgent things, which is to, if your priority is to get cash flow in, if it's, significant loss of income, try to get that life insurance policy done quickly. And if there are people around you that can help with any of the processing of it, have help and make sure it's done correctly, so that there's no delay of payment or revocation of payment, because some people really need that payment for survival. And I think also, who's got the deed on the house, or the mortgage payments that need to be made? Can you be housed, or are you going to be forced to move, sell, do all of those things? But I think the priorities are really, making sure there's no fraud, fraudulent charges, because oftentimes obituaries and other notices are public. And unfortunately, we live in an age where they're scamming every minute of every day. And that's so unfortunate. So, to close the leak, the hole, to make sure not, there's no further erosion, bring in some income, and try to tamp down on spending as much as possible by, closing those accounts and health insurance, like the big cost items first.
Absolutely. So what we're trying to do is buy time. And so there are some things that are really urgent, and cash, you mentioned, is one of them, access to cash. So being able to claim bank accounts, that's probably towards the top of the list, because you have bills to pay and we have to just make sure that we can exist. And so whether it's buying a couple of months or more, that often allows you to delay some of the bigger decisions of how to transfer the other major assets. But buying that time is extremely valuable because you probably want to get through the funeral and the services first. Yeah, I think a
Right.
lot of people want to find that closure. And then you can start to tackle addressing the legal issues and more of the major financial issues and starting to develop a game plan around how to actually do that. So, buying time in the beginning, making sure that all of the bills can be paid first and foremost, so the electricity doesn't get shut off and you still have the ability to go be somewhere safe at night, right?
Hmm.
Um, these basic necessities have to be met. And so we have to really prioritize that. And then once you start to have the ability to tackle some of the other large issues, then formulating a plan around that, getting the help, building that network of support so that you don't have to do it all yourself, I think would be kind of the big second step. And it's a huge, huge second step.
Yeah, you're right. That gives you breathing time too. So hopefully some of the fog has lifted and you've got a little bit more clarity. One thing I did want to just point out, just as a note, is the joint bank accounts. Really important not to notify the bank of your spouse's death if you have a joint bank account. To this day, I am still receiving checks in Doug's name. Because if you notify them of a death, they will close the account. You will freeze out all of your access to funds. So that's a really important thing that I'd heard from someone else who had made that mistake. In your kind of wanting to check things off of your list when you put the bank down as something to notify, hold off on that one about the death itself because you don't want them to freeze access to your accounts.
Yeah, and I think what I meant to say there was you want to make sure you have access to the money,
Right.
not that you want to close off everything. So thank you for pointing out that nuance,
Yeah.
Samina. That's
It's
it's really
someone I
important.
yeah, someone I know, it happened to them, and so I was sure not to do that, and, I was just at the bank this morning making a deposit, and someone, an old insurance company cut him a check, and so it goes into our joint bank account with his name on it still, and this is 2 years later, so I don't know when that's closing.
Yeah, and, you may have to keep that open for a little while. This process, as we mentioned earlier, is extremely long, unfortunately. Some things take a very long period of time to settle. I think for some people, they think that everything needs to be done right away. And that's not really true. I think you can give yourself some grace. You can give yourself some space to say, hey, these things will naturally take a long time. And I'm just going to let that hang out there for a little bit, as painful as that might be. But that allows you some more room to tackle the things that are more urgent. So having that organized list allows you to stay on top of it. And hopefully over time, that list dwindles down. And then eventually you get to check off that final box and you can kind of move forward away from these tasks anyway.
Yeah, and a lot of these tasks you can delegate. So that's really important too for those who are supporting people, spouses who have lost their significant other, their better half. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you wrap up with any final words, and I would love it if you could let people know how they could get in touch with you if they have any questions or would like to reach out to you.
For anyone who experiences loss like this, it's really important to build a support network, to understand that there are people that can help you, that you don't have to do it all alone, that you can take some time with some of these, but there are a few issues that you really want to tackle right away. Just make sure that the immediate things take precedence and tackle that first. Take care of yourself in the process because this is a marathon and you need to continue to take a lot of steps. So make sure that you have the ability to continue to go on. Certainly, if you have children, they're looking at you every single day to see, hey, are we going to be okay? And you want to be able to confidently say, yeah, we're going to be okay. And find help where you can, find professional help where appropriate, and minimize the mistakes that can be made, and also minimize the mental burden of having to figure out all of the mazes that you have to go through with each of these tasks that are often necessary. So I very much appreciate you having me on your podcast, Samina. It's wonderful that you have the bravery to talk about this. It takes a lot of vulnerability to put your situation out there and say, hey, here's what I had to struggle with and continue to struggle with. And it's a reality that a lot of people face, but they don't really talk about. So thank you for doing that for everybody. And for anyone who is looking for help and just looking at maybe a second opinion in this kind of situation or any general wealth management, investment management questions, you can reach me at terrafirmawealth.com. Terra firma means solid ground or solid earth in Latin. So I hope that you can find your solid ground to be able to continue to walk on and move forward.
Thank you again, Jason.